Stories of Impact brings back some of our favorite conversations this season. Today, we continue our series about how citizens can understand and heal polarization, with a conversation with Dr. Sean Westwood. We aired this episode for the first time in April of 2025, at a time of extreme political turbulence in America. Dr. Westwood puts today's polarization in a historical and international context, and explains that while the gap between people on each side of the political aisle might be further than ever, most Americans share a deep respect for democracy. Welcome to Stories of Impact. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. Usually, Stories of Impact brings you just that, stories. But today, we're offering a different take. When we spoke recently with Dr. Sean Westwood, Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth College and the Director of the Polarization Research Lab, we knew we wanted to share the conversation with you as quickly as possible because it speaks so directly to the current moment. So let's jump right in. Here's Dr. Westwood.
I study American politics and how partisan conflict manifests in the United States, its consequences, and its origins.
What sparked his interest in the political science of partisan conflict?
There were individuals in my peer group who were making judgments about others solely on partisanship. So, determining whether or not they wanted to have lunch with someone or spend time with them. And that seemed to be troubling to me, but perhaps indicative of a larger pattern. Obviously, it's the case that as an academic, sometimes we live in a bit of a bubble. So, I was really interested in if what I was observing was a larger phenomena in the country or just something that was happening among hyper-motivated partisans. And that really started the research projects that have led to where I am today.
What is the picture of partisanship in America today?
It is the case in the US that not everyone votes. And of those subset who do vote, not everyone affiliates as a partisan. So some will say that they're Democrats, some will say that they're Republicans. About 30% will say they're Democrats, about 25% will say they're Republicans. If you actually probe those independents, the vast majority, about 90%, will say, well, I'm closer to the Republican Party or I'm closer to the Democratic Party. And those 10% who say that they're independent and don't lean towards one party or the other tend to just be super disengaged folks. So partisanship you can just define as if you self-label as a Democrat or a Republican, but it's often the case when doing analysis or when looking at the data, you need to also group those who would say that they're independents, but who really behave like Democrats or Republicans.
What's his definition of polarization?
In terms of polarization, I think there are three general ways that you can think about it. So one is ideological. Do you take a position that is to the extreme left or to the extreme right, and are others on the other side of the aisle taking the inverse position? And is that growing over time? The second is affective. What affective polarization captures is the extent to which we see our party as good and the other party as bad, so that the distance between us isn't ideological disagreement, but it's emotional and much less logical. So the idea is that most Americans really just don't know much about politics. If you're to ask them on what side of the debate do Republicans fall on abortion, they're probably going to get that right. But if you're to ask them on what side of, let's say, land use do Democrats fall, they're probably going to get that wrong. So we're in a world where Americans don't know very much about policy, but at the same time have very strong tribalistic connections to their party. And then I think the third way of thinking about polarization is just cultural, right? Like, are we dividing on issues outside of the political domain? But I think that most meaningful at the moment is probably affective, because there's concern that affective polarization will motivate people to push back against democratic norms or engage in political violence or perhaps back away from the core principles of our country.
To clarify, Dr. Westwood is referring to affective with an A, affective polarization. And what he means by that is
So affect here is just capturing the emotional sentiment you have to groups that you belong and animosity that you have to groups that you don't belong. Humans, by nature, form tribal affiliations, and also by nature, we view those who are with us very positively and those who are against us as very negatively. And it can be as simple as if you're in New York and you pay attention to the Yankees, you're a Yankees fan, you're going to view other folks who also like the Yankees more positively and folks who don't like the Yankees as much more negatively. And it turns out that these kind of basic instincts apply to things much more insidious than just baseball or football or region. They apply to politics and religion and other things like that. So, what we're really focused on is how individuals came to hate the other side.
This is a core investigation of Dr. Westwood's Polarization Research Lab. What has he discovered?
We see in survey data that Americans hate the other side and seem to like their own side. We wanted to understand what are the consequences of that, right? So is it the case that this is just puffery? Is this just an attitude that people are expressing, or does it actually lead to negative outcomes? And more importantly, where does it come from, right? So how did we go from a country that in the 1970s was relatively indifferent towards the other side to a country where most Americans have very strong negative views of the other side? What is causing that change to manifest over time? And then is it the case that we have reached a stasis where partisan hatred isn't going to grow anymore? Or are we just continuing to see our political culture devolve further and further?
Dr. Westwood is in the middle of a 3-year research study. What's his aim?
There's, I think, a lot of American exceptionalism out there. We tend to think that what's happening to us is special, that our political system is special. And I don't know if that's the right way to think about it. So there's a view that democracy is a consistent enterprise and that the threats that we're facing in this country are just a function of democracy, not necessarily a function of the profile or the nature of political conflict here. We wanted to figure out, are the problems that Americans are observing in their government an indication of our special situation as Americans, or are they just challenges inherent to democracy? And to do that, we're collecting really robust data on partisan animosity, so effective polarization, support for democratic norm violations, support for partisan violence in the US and in 5 countries across the globe. And we were really strategic in selecting these countries. We wanted countries that have a long history of stable democracy. We wanted countries that are pushing back from the chains of Soviet communism. And we wanted countries that are really unstable, countries that have a history of military coups, that are in an active state of war, or where democracy is becoming somewhat subservient to ethnic and religious divides. So the goal here is to try to understand the threats to democracy globally and not just within the US. So there's obviously a desire as an American to say, well, how does America compare? And that's really important, and that's something that we're doing. But I think the other component of this is just to try to document the threats that exist in those other countries that we're exploring.
What are the 5 countries, and how are they chosen?
So we're looking at Brazil, Germany, India, Israel, and Poland. So we wanted to not just randomly pick countries from the world. We also didn't want to pick countries that only came from one region, so Europe or Asia. We wanted to try to maximize our coverage across as many points of difference as possible. And as I said, we wanted to have that spectrum, right? So Germany is a relatively stable democracy, at least in the period post World War II. Poland represents new democracy, a country that's pushing back from communism. Brazil and India have histories of military coups, of unstable governments, and a great deal of political violence. So they're much more towards the edge. And then Israel is a country that's now facing an active military conflict.
Dr. Westwood gathered a multidisciplinary cohort of scientists, including teams of American and global advisors, with specialists from each of the countries in which they're studying. He says that in the U.S., he and his team have interviewed 140,000 individuals, and globally, 25,000 people have been interviewed. What else can he tell us about his study, called Taking the Pulse of Global Partisan Animosity?
We've drafted surveys to try and capture these attitudes, and we've been administering them on the YouGov platform for about a year and a half now. What we decided to do was identify the core threats to democracy that exist in each of these countries and measure those directly. So there is a lot of domain-specific exploration going on in each of these countries that's been facilitated by the experts that we're working with. In one branch, it's the power of singular leaders. So that would be the president in the US or prime ministers in Israel and India. I think another core thread is the power of the judiciary and the ability of the judiciary to hold either the legislative in most of these countries or the executive in the United States to account. And then voting rights. There are countries where certain populations are either unable to vote or unable to vote for the party that they identify with. Or if they do vote for a particular party, say AfD in Germany, their vote won't necessarily matter because the party has been banned from engaging in government coalitions. There are legitimate reasons to not want AfD to be in a coalition, but there are perhaps less legitimate reasons to want to exclude minority populations from voting rights in other countries. So I think what we're trying to do is not only document positive threats, but also negative threats, and to try to understand how common these negative attitudes are across the world.
What are the Polarization Research Lab's findings so far?
If you listen to American media, the expectation is that America is the worst. There have been a number of prominent research studies that now say that American government is no longer democratic. And it is certainly the case there are a lot of threats towards democracy in this country. I don't want to trivialize them. But if we think about threats to democratic norms and public support for threats to democratic norms, public support for democratic norm violations is much, much higher in other countries, especially countries that are much less stable. American public support is near the bottom. Germany's also doing quite well. So Germany and America seem to be relatively consistent in terms of public support of rejecting democratic norm violations. Yes, there is an American problem, but globally, thinking of India and Brazil and Poland, globally, the problem might even be far worse. It's a similar story for political violence. American support for political violence is very, very low relative to other countries that have regular kidnappings and assassination attempts, far more regular than what we see in the US, seem to have much higher support for partisan violence. So in terms of where we are as a country, I think there's a lot of room for optimism. If we're thinking about where the world is on support for democratic norm violations or support for political violence, I think there's a lot of room for concern.
But America is going through enormous political turbulence at the moment. So what explains Dr. Westwood's optimism?
Americans grew up with democracy, right? We've been fortunate enough to have had hundreds of years of successful democracy behind us. Whereas in other countries, there are reasonably large populations who've seen authoritarianism, who've seen communism, who've seen other forms of government, and who've seen rapid change in government. So I think that there is a sense of stability in this country that makes us more committed to democracy. The other thing that's quite important to note is that when it comes to support for democratic norm violations in the US specifically and globally, it is almost never the case that it's one specific party. I think in the US, one thing that gets perhaps pushed under the rug is that Democrats and Republicans both strongly support democracy, the citizenry at least strongly support democracy. And when it comes to support for norm violations, things like overturning court rulings made by justices appointed by the other party, or censoring the opposition, or removing polling places in areas dominated by the political opposition, those are minority views. And that's consistent for both Democrats and Republicans. I think the fundamental point, though, is that Americans aren't demanding anti democratic behavior. And we can see that in some more topical issues right now. Americans are not behind Doge. They're not behind Elon Musk. They're not behind a lot of what is transpiring in Washington right now. So it isn't the case that there's this demand for anti democratic attitude. It's, in fact, much more of a top down supply story where Americans are willing to tolerate politicians who are against democracy and are not selecting them because they're against democracy, but are selecting them for other reasons and tolerating their anti-democratic tendencies.
And how important is that in terms of democratic versus anti-democratic forces?
Americans aren't stupid. They know that Trump stands for some very troubling policy positions. But if you were to ask Trump voters, many of them will say, yes, I don't agree with that, but I think he's right on the economy, or I think he's right on immigration, or I think he's right on other policy areas. So it isn't that Americans are inattentive to what their leaders are doing. It's just that in making the voter calculus, they would much rather pick someone who agrees with them on their core policies, but may disagree on democracy. So the key then is to try and convince the public to vote on democracy, or even more importantly, to try and convince elites that democracy matters. So if you're in office now and you see that your voters will support you even if you push back against democracy, there are very little incentives for you to stand up to democracy. We need leadership to push back, right? We need leaders in both parties, in the House and the Senate, to stand up for democracy because the voters aren't going to be able to do it, certainly in any reasonable way in a responsive timeline. So it has to come top down. It has to be the case that our elected officials say democracy is what matters.
What are the findings from the other 5 locations of the study, the takeaways about the leadership of those countries?
I think a really interesting case is India because essentially the political divide is the religious divide. The ruling party, the BJP, is a Hindu nationalist party. So the leaders of that party are able to capitalize not only on political affiliation, but often also on religious affiliation, which makes it even more challenging to push back as a citizen in India. We have a similar phenomena in Israel where the political powers often align with religious factions. So I think that in the US, we're actually quite lucky because we've only got this one dimension separating us. We've only got politics. But in other countries where race or ethnicity or religion overlap with partisanship, it's even more challenging for the citizenry to push back or to select another candidate or to vote for another party. So, to a certain extent, I think that the path that Americans are on is perhaps easier to correct than the path that India is walking down.
Does Dr. Westwood agree that religion is playing a bigger role than ever in American politics as well?
So certainly religion is creeping much more into politics, but I think the key is that there are Catholics who are Republican and Catholics who are Democrat. There are Jewish folks who are Republican, there are Jewish folks who are Democratic. It isn't that there's this perfect sorting where everyone who identifies in one religion is in one party and everyone who identifies for another is in the other party. It is the case, though, that you're quite right. There is a growing sense of religious identity, especially among evangelical populations, that is moving towards the Republican Party. And that's been happening since Ronald Reagan in the 1980s.
What have been some of the surprises of his study?
The really surprising thing globally is that Americans are much more polarized on affective lines than other citizens, but that does not manifest with higher levels of support for democratic norm violations and political violence. And I think the reason for that is that the two-party system in America is very odd. If we look at the other countries under exploration, the parties are much more competitive. They're multi-party states. And I think that the key lesson there is that multi-party states make it much harder to identify a singular opposition. And as a consequence, makes it much harder to hate just a single group of individuals for their partisan affiliation. So I think it's quite surprising how, even in countries that are undergoing significant turmoil, effective polarization seems to be less meaningful than it is here in the United States. It's also quite surprising how stable these results are over time. So there are a lot of major events that transpire day to day, week to week, month to month. But it does seem as if support for democracy, support for political violence seems to be pretty stable, which suggests that Americans and Europeans and everyone in our data set, they're thinking about democracy with a much greater sense of principle and a much greater sense of cohesion than perhaps many might expect. So I think the results are quite surprising. So we saw 2 assassination attempts for Trump in the 2024 campaign. And because we're collecting data daily, we can actually monitor changes at really small timescales. And we actually found the opposite, I think, of what most in the pundit class are worried about. We found that in response to the first assassination attempt, Republicans specifically did not grow to endorse violence. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Republicans became much less supportive of political violence, political murder especially, with it dropping to essentially zero. And that's not true just for Republicans, but also for MAGA Republicans. We also saw a strong sense of affiliation or identity with the Republican Party. So after the assassination attempt, Republicans became much more connected to the Republican Party, but didn't manifest anger towards the Democrats. We have evidence to suggest that the public is responsive to truly major events, but that it is not clear that the public is willing to escalate in response to major events. Now, that certainly could change in the future. That certainly could be the case moving forward. But at the moment, at least, it does seem as if there's not a desire to escalate in response to crisis.
While Dr. Westwood has heard talk in the pundit class of a soft civil war going on in the U.S., he says he doesn't have any evidence of that.
We have lone wolf individuals who are deeply troubled committing acts of political violence. The key thing that defines most of those folks is that they are not coordinating with any kind of hierarchy structure. They're acting on their own. So we don't see coordinated attacks against the government. We don't see coordinated attacks against political parties. And we don't see individuals who are otherwise rational deciding that they're going to commit acts of political violence. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. We had January 6th. We've had a number of individuals who've committed acts of violence that are not motivated just by mental illness. But I think that the major events that define political conflict in this country are not violent. And when they are violent, are not coordinated. I think it's hard to reconcile with a world of a civil war or a soft revolution. It just seems to be isolated events without a cohesive overall narrative.
How does the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol fit into his rubric? Dr. Westwood says
January 6th is a really troubling event for two reasons. So the first is that it happened at all, and the second is how it's been rehabilitated or redefined in the period that followed. So there are a number of really prominent folks in the media who have successfully redefined the event, along with Donald Trump himself, as patriots protesting and supporting the country, and really do gloss over the deaths that occurred, the assaults that occurred, the property damage that occurred. So is January 6th an example of really troubling political violence? Yeah, absolutely. Is it an example of an isolated event that has not led to future events? I think also, yeah, absolutely. So there really was a risk that January 6th would have been more than what it was, that it would have manifested with conflict on the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, right? That there would have been extreme pushback against the government. There would be localized events across the country, but we just didn't see that. There was an effort to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, but that was stopped. And other than those two events, we have not seen any kind of coordinated attacks against our government institutions. So I think that January 6th was troubling, but it didn't become a watershed moment. It didn't become an inflection point where the public starts to become more violent.
Would he call it an outlier?
So I would call it an outlier in objective terms, but I don't think that I would want to use that term more publicly just simply because I think people would misinterpret it to suggest that it wasn't important. So I think it was very, very important, but it is not something that has happened with any regularity or something that I think is indicative of overall patterns in this country. So methodologically, intellectually, it's an outlier, but still one worthy of a lot of attention.
What does the data reveal about the American experiment that prevented January 7th, 8th, 9th?
We do find that between 1% and 2% of the American population is willing to support political violence, willing to stand behind political violence. But they're dispersed. There aren't clusters of these folks in Chicago or New York. We have lots of folks who are willing to support political violence, but they're in communities all across the country and aren't aware of one another. So there's really no ability to act in a coordinated way. I think that's really the primary explanation for why we didn't see further violence on the 7th and the 8th. A lot of the folks who showed up on January 6th did have some sense that they were going to question the election outcome, that they were going to march in the Capitol. But a lot of them were kind of sucked into the event, were drawn into the Capitol by others who were leading the assault. We just didn't have that kind of leadership emerging elsewhere. So I think that the biggest explanation is that these folks are diffuse and disconnected. Now, that of course does suggest that it is possible for them to come together, right? It is possible for them to grow some kind of hierarchy. It is possible for them to grow some kind of cell-based structure, but we just don't have that right now.
Is the possibility of January 6th sort of violence present in the other places he's studied?
There are much more organized groups in Germany, in Israel, and in India that have conducted political violence, thinking about AfD in Germany or fundamentalists in both Israel and India. And that poses, I think, a much more serious threat. And that's also recorded in the data. So in the US, we have 2% of Americans willing to support political violence. That number goes up to somewhere around 20% in India. So there are places where there is this coordination structure in place and where public support is much higher. And I think both of those things are a consequence of observing political violence, but also a cause of future political violence. So there's, I think, much more reason to be concerned globally about the threat that political violence poses and the willingness of the population to support political violence.
By using other countries in his study, does it help Dr. Westwood understand the U.S. better?
I think it does. I think it suggests two things that are really important. So, one is that we should be worried, but we shouldn't panic. Things are bad, but they're certainly not as bad as they could be. And I think the second thing is it really does highlight where things might head if we don't attenuate our more emotional tendencies and our willingness to engage in denigration of the opposition. So, there's a real concern that the United States could become more unstable and could follow in the path of political divides in these other countries. So I think it's both reassuring in suggesting that we're not there yet, but also potentially a sign of what might come.
Are there interventions and policy prescriptions that will come out of his research?
One of the things that we've learned is that this is a really hard thing to change. It's really hard to convince Americans to have a different view of the opposing party. And that's primarily because when you have a positive encounter, that's often just drowned out by social media or by cable news. And this is the case in all countries. Bottom up change is probably going to be really, really challenging. We can artificially construct positive encounters, positive messaging campaigns, create incentives to get along. But the reality is the change is probably going to need to come top down. We're going to need to find ways to make our politicians more willing to stand for the principles of democracy, to not vilify the other party, to agree that in competitive democratic systems, there's going to be disagreement, there's going to be policy conflict, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those who disagree are immoral or unpatriotic or evil or whatever negative label you might want to ascribe. It's really the case that we need more positive messaging and leadership. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try from the bottom up, but I think for the bottom up movements to have success, they need to co-occur with really healthy top down messaging. And that sounds almost impossible, right? Like in the current system, imagining leaders who are going to commit to civility. But we've seen it. There was a really prominent initiative run by the National Governors Association in the United States by Spencer Cox, who was the governor of Utah. And what they did is they brought together governors from the two parties and they engaged in messaging campaigns with their constituents to say, it's okay to disagree on policy. That's what America does. But that doesn't mean that we have to not like one another as people. And those messaging campaigns had positive effects. So there is a real chance for political leaders to step up. It's probably going to be at the state level. It's probably going to not be the leader of the BJP or the leader of the Democratic Party, the leader of the Republican Party, the leader of Likud. But you can imagine lower level politicians successfully demonstrating to Americans and the world what responsible democracy looks like. And the hope then would be that we're able to elevate those leaders who are really truly committing to democracy and maybe moving away from those who aren't. It just seems much more plausible as an initial step to try and do that at the local or the state level. But I don't think that it's impossible at the national level either.
How does Dr. Westwood plan to make a concrete impact?
We can do two things. So the first is that we can document the state of the problem and we can document that what's currently occurring isn't fixing the problem, right? So I think that that's a bit of a depressing thing, but it's certainly the case that we have a point of entrance to the debate. I think the second thing is that we are actually trying to promote data suggesting that elites are the cause of these negative attitudes, that elected officials are driving political conflict in this country, and that there's a subset of those elected officials who are especially responsible for that behavior. So by pointing that out, I think we can also show the American public, the global public, what is driving conflict. And as a consequence, perhaps show or explicate what kinds of leaders we should stand behind and what kinds of leaders we should move away from. So, in terms of concrete policy, I don't think that there's something that can be done in the legislature. I don't think there's something that can be done in official capacities of government. I think what needs to happen has to occur within parties and within informal institutions. So, just convincing the public that they have a false perspective of conflict at the elite level or that they have leaders who are not serving them is the path forward.
How would Dr. Westwood rank American politics today compared to other periods of American history?
There's a fundamental problem in trying to make empirical claims about the nature or the magnitude of partisan conflict in this country. We started seriously collecting these data in the 1970s. So we have this tendency to say that things are bad today relative to where they were in the 70s. But I don't think that accurately reflects the low points of our history. So, in terms of political conflict, we have gone through a civil war. We went through the civil rights movement. Today, a lot of headlines focus on Donald Trump and his lack of responsiveness to the courts. But I think people forget that Andrew Jackson, in response to the Supreme Court, said they've made their ruling, now let them enforce it. We have seen presidents openly mock the judiciary and the legislative branch, but we've recovered. I think it's also the case that we tend to potentially romanticize some of this. So, FDR was quite willing to eviscerate disagreement within the executive branch and within the legislative branch to keep his New Deal policies alive. There is a lot of similarity between what happened in the New Deal and what is happening today with Doge. Now, obviously, to different ends for different political purposes, but I think that the overarching point here is that we've seen upheavals before. We've seen presidents ignore the courts. We've seen presidents gut the bureaucratic infrastructure of the executive and recovered. That doesn't mean that it's guaranteed to happen. But I think the really important point is that we shouldn't give up on democracy. We shouldn't see what's happening now as a coup or an unrecoverable constitutional crisis. That may very well happen, but we're not there yet. And if you want to keep voters engaged, if you want voters to try and mobilize and support future elections, you can't tell them that hope is lost. So I think that the most irresponsible thing that a politician could do right now is argue that democracy is over. I think what we want to do is very carefully and very rationally explain that democracy is under threat, but that there is still a democratic system in place. Don't give up. I think the other thing I would say is when it comes to political violence, we are nowhere near peak political violence. In the 1970s, there were eco terrorists, there were bombings, there were kidnappings and assassinations. So, yes, there has been an uptick in political violence over the last 10 or 20 years, but relative to the 1970s and the 1960s, even, things are not nearly as bad as they have been in points of our history. I'm not convinced that American government is insulated from non existence or democracy is so fixed that it won't be removed. But I'm still really optimistic about our future and our ability to recover.
Where does this sense of resilience in America's democratic framework come from?
Americans love America. Even though Americans may have limited trust in government, they may hate members of the other political party, they still love America. They think that America is a great country and it's a country worth protecting. There is a desire for citizens to see this country succeed. And I think that's true overseas as well. In other countries, patriotism manifests in different ways. Patriotism means something different in Germany from what it means in the United States. But historical connection to democracy, and more importantly, the success that we've derived from democracy is really something that stands out in the minds of the citizenry. So, as much as we may have social inequality or income inequality, it is the case that the standard of living in the United States is much, much higher than it is in countries that have communist systems or authoritarian regimes. And that's something that Americans also are attentive to and observe. So I don't think there's a single component of our government or any democratic society that makes it likely to maintain or likely to dissolve. But the more history you have and the more tangible success that citizens can observe, I think the more successful and the more committed those citizens are to democracy.
Is there a political marker that, if crossed, Dr. Westwood would turn from optimistic to pessimistic?
There are a lot of folks who try to define bright lines in the sand, the point where we're a democracy and not a democracy. I think the only clear bright line for me is if we stop holding elections and if we stop free and open elections and then we stop the transition of power. So if we didn't see free and open elections in 2026 or 2028, or if we didn't see a transfer of power in 2026, perhaps in the House, or 2028 in the presidency, the Senate, and maybe the House as well, then I would say that democracy is over. But I think that it's really challenging to say that an elected government is no longer democratic if a court decision is ignored or if a group of bureaucrats is fired, or even if they're politically motivated investigations or penalties of law firms or past candidates. These are all incredibly troubling anti-democratic behaviors, but I don't think that they, even in some, say that democracy is over.
The whole intent of studying polarization is to help reduce polarization. So what do we do at home and elsewhere?
The point of studying this is to understand how bad things are and to ensure that things aren't getting worse. I think that the solution is really hard. The solution is to get citizens of the world to pay attention to what their government is doing, to pay attention to the good things that their government is doing, the bad things that their government is doing, and to be willing to say, I'm going to vote for someone potentially from the other party who is more committed to democracy than a member of my own party who's very much committed to the dissolution of democracy. That's a really hard ask. That's something that's against the more basic political instincts of a lot of citizens. But that's the path forward. You have to censure, you have to stop, you have to get anti-democratic elected officials out of office. And that sounds, as I said, it sounds really, really challenging, but I think it's hard to forget that the 2024 presidential election was very close. Trump won the popular vote, but the margin of victory was small. It is not as if it was a 1980s Reagan revolution. It was an outcome by the slimmest of majorities. And that's how we've seen the majority of the presidential elections over the last 20 years. So you just have to get a small subset of the American population to see democracy as important. And I think that the key thing to note there is that the Democrats tried to run on a democracy platform, but they didn't explain it very well. They said, you need to vote for democracy. Democracy's on the ballot, which is well and good. That's probably true. But to get the public to pay attention to that, you have to explain why. You have to say that you need to vote for democracy so that your standard of living is maintained, so that your kids will have a better quality of life than you, so that your retirement is secure, so that inflation goes down. And if you're able to make those kinds of arguments, well-informed, careful arguments, I do think it is possible to convince a substantially large enough portion of the American public to commit to democracy that election outcomes in the future very well might flip to more pro-democratic candidates. And I don't think that that means, not voting for Republicans, voting for Democrats. I think that there are a lot of folks in both parties who are very strongly Democratic. And I think that there are populists in both parties as well. And the last thing that we want is to go from a Republican populist to a Democratic populist, because I think that's just going to make it so that these kinds of extreme politicians and the extreme conflict that goes around them become the norm. I think what we need, honestly, is to go from a destructive candidate to a really boring, technocratic, effective political leader.
We'll be back next week with a second timely interview with Dr. Kurt Gray, author of Outraged: Why We Fight About Morality in Politics and How to Find Common Ground. In the meantime, please help us make an impact and share the Stories of Impact podcast. You can get in touch at storiesofimpact.org. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with an interview by Richard Sergey. Written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions. Assistant producer Oscar Falk. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.